The Americans had plenty of money and they paid practically no taxes. British taxes on America cost the average American $1.20 a year. And most of these were invisible taxes paid on imports. The British had a national debt of over 150 million pounds, and there was constant talk in London about the whole country going bankrupt. Their taxes were 25 times higher than the Americans. So they were not particularly impressed when the Americans screamed that you can't tax us.
With a population of over 20,000 in the 1760s, the thriving New England port of Boston was, after Philadelphia, the second largest city in America. Here, political radicals known as Whigs or Patriots first felt the burden of British taxation and resisted it. As early as 1760, a Boston lawyer and political theorist named James Otis saw the seeds of tyranny in arbitrarily imposed taxes.
There is a man who is forgotten, and he's more important than any of them, at least as far as the way that the revolution started, and that's James Otis. It was his writings which were the inspiration for Sam Adams, John Hancock, and indeed all the others. Otis was the mind behind it. Sam Adams was the mouth.
Samuel Adams was a radical by nature. He saw tyranny coming through the windows in all directions. And he really became the closest thing we had to a professional revolutionary. He did nothing really much else to support himself in Boston except agitate.
Early taxes like the Sugar Act affected only wealthy shippers and distillers. But in 1765, the Stamp Act affected everyone by mandating that a stamp purchased from the British government be embossed on all legal documents and newspapers. Sam Adams used the growing opposition to Britain's new laws to organize a political action group named the Sons of Liberty. In Boston and throughout the colonies, the Tories, or Loyalists, saw things differently than Sam Adams and his Patriot companions. They often wanted their relationship with England to change too, but they wanted peaceful change, and above all, they wanted to remain within the confines of the British Empire.
John Adams divided the population up into thirds. He said a third were for the revolution, a third were opposed, a third were neutral. The Loyalists thought people like Samuel Adams, the Sons of Liberty, were demagogues who were ambitious people, who wanted to make it to the top of the political or the economic ladder, who had self-interested motives, and who were very cunning. They often use the word, or a variation of the word cunning, to describe the Patriot leaders.
For Loyalists like Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson, whose three-story home was destroyed by Patriots in 1765, the Sons of Liberty weren't noble idealists. They were a mob.
They call me a brainless Tory. But tell me, which is better? To be ruled by one tyrant 3,000 miles away, or by 3,000 tyrants not a mile away? Mather Barnes, Boston Loyalist.
One common way of dealing with Loyalists was to put hot tar on their bodies and put chicken feathers on top of the hot tar, and to take the person in a cart up and down Main Street so that everybody in the community could show their disdain for these people.
Britain, secure in her might, refused to be intimidated by her upstart colonists. She would tax as she pleased, and her colonies would behave and pay.
The colonies are not to be emancipated from their dependence on the supremacy of England. George III.
George III was certainly not a tyrant. He was devoted to the Constitution as the British knew it, to a constitutional monarchy, parliamentary monarchy. the Americans were challenging the British Constitution, which was, in British eyes, the only constitution in the world, the only parliamentary constitution, the only constitution of free men.
The king relied on his ministers, especially his prime minister, Lord Frederick North.
Upon my word, if we are to run after America in search of reconciliation, I do not know a single act of Parliament that will remain. Lord Frederick North.
To protect their tax collectors and government officials from mobs like the Sons of Liberty, Britain began to quarter permanent troops in Boston. Their presence led to the event sensationalized in this engraving by Paul Revere. His friend Sam Adams fully exploited the event in his propagandistic writings, referring to it as the Boston Massacre. It was a cold March night in 1770. A lone British sentry held his post on King Street. Bands of citizens were on the streets, angry after a minor confrontation with another soldier earlier in the day. A mob began to form, the sentry the target of their anger. Nearby, Captain Thomas Preston marched his guards to the sentry's side. The mob began to throw snowballs, chunks of ice, at the British soldiers. One fell, and his musket fired in the air. Preston shouted to his men to hold their fire, but he was too late. His frightened, angry men fired into the crowd. Five citizens died, including Crispus Attucks, a former slave. Sam Adams demanded that the soldiers be tried for murder and that all British troops be removed from Boston. Governor Hutchinson, fearing rioting, ordered the troops removed from the city proper. Later in the year, the soldiers from the massacre were tried. They were defended by three men, including one of the finest lawyers in Boston, a patriot, Sam Adams' cousin, John Adams.
Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. John Adams at the massacre trials.
All but two of the soldiers were acquitted. Those two were court-martialed and then dismissed from the service. With his Boston Massacre hysteria diffused, Sam Adams would have to wait for over 3 years until December of 1773 to engineer a truly decisive protest over attacks on British monopolized tea. Colonists, dressed as Mohawk Indians, boarded tea-laden merchant ships, threw 23,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor, and then burned several of the vessels.
The tax on tea was 3 pence a pound, and that meant the average man would have to drink a gallon of tea a day to pay a $1 tax at the end of the year. So you really couldn't say that this was a cause for revolution. The sense that the British were slowly trying to take control of the American colonies, that is the essence of the perturbed state of the American mind in the 1770s.
After the Boston Tea Party, Britain struck back hard with a series of acts known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. The first of the acts closed Boston Harbor. The number of British troops there swelled to 3,000. The Patriot propagandists' ravings about repression and economic ruin had become reality. In Williamsburg, Virginia, at a 1765 session of the House of Burgesses, Radical Patrick Henry proclaimed in a fiery speech that taxation without representation is tyranny.
One of the few things we remember about the American Revolution is no taxation without representation. Benjamin Franklin, when he went to England to act as more or less the unofficial representative for several colonies, he wound up really speaking for all of them, he was told by the people he was representing, under no circumstances should he ever accept a deal for representation in the British Parliament. The last thing they wanted was to be represented in the British Parliament because they knew that they would be totally outvoted. No taxation without representation was strictly a slogan.
It was much more than simply taxation without representation. It was a war of ideas. The concept of independence was late in coming, but as the war opened and developed, the whole concept of personal and national liberty took control and was essentially the driving force.
Confrontation with another soldier